In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to create a chair seat cushion in 3D Studio Max. This is what our final result is going to look like. You'll notice that it is tucked away around these chair legs. It's got a nice, gentle cushioning shape to it, and there is a little bit of piping here at the bottom. So let's get started. So the first step is to create a basic shape. It's going to be the general boundary outline for this. You want to slowly start shaping it to conform roughly to the shape you want your seat cushion to look like eventually, and we're going to do it using a symmetry approach, which means we're going to model 1/2 of a seat cushion and then reflect it about the x-axis. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a series of face edges, more or less subdivisions for this very simple plane object that we've created. And the way we're going to use these, make it simple, let's get our seat plane, the same plane as the top of our chair here. And the general approach here is that we want to adjust these edge points to be pretty close to the edge of the chair, overlapping just a little bit like you'd see a seat cushion in the real world. So that's on the sides and the front. That's pretty good. In the back here, you'll note is usually where you want a little extra. We'll do the same thing here, which is going to be to add a little bit of curvature as well. Just a little bit more here. Yeah, that's looking good. Back here. Alright, so that is more or less half of what we want our seat shape to look like. So the next step is to carve out a little bit of area to make accommodations for our chair legs, which is roughly the same process. We're going to create another edge loop here. And now the only thing that's going to be a little weird here is we're going to put an edge constraint on our model, our Edit Poly modifier. And what that does is, more or less, when you move around one of these vertex points, it's going to constrain it to the edge that's closest to the direction of the axis or the plane that it's moving in. So see, even though I'm like trying to move it way over here, it's constrained to that edge. And basically that just makes it easy to keep our underlying shape that we created in the first step. So what we're doing here is trying to align this up to where the chair leg intersects with the seat cushion, and we just delete that face. Now we're going to do the same thing here in the back. Take a quick peek to make sure that looks like we're on target. Yep. Okie dokie. I'm going to even these out just a little bit here. It's not really necessary, but my own experience has taught me that the more uniformly distributed these lines are, the better your end product's going to be. So there we go, just a little bit of course correction there. So our next step is to reflect this model. Let's see here. Just some little tweaks that you don't have to do. It's a bit of a perfectionist's tendency. Okay, so now that we have our entire seat shape, and that's going to look like that. You'll note that there are a slight curve on the front, the back, and we have cutouts for the legs. So our next step is to give this seat a little bit of thickness. We're going to use the shell modifier, and just because I know this is a good thickness, we're going to use 2.5 inches. So our next step is to add a little bit of shape to this. And for that, we're going to use the Turbosmooth modifier. But before the Turbosmooth, we're going to put an Edit Poly modifier down here. And this is going to be the basis of our subdivision modeling approach. So what you want to do here is you want to make sure that you have the Show End Result toggle on. You want to select your edge submodifier and you want to show cage. And what this is going to do is going to allow us to see this Edit Poly modifier before the Turbosmooth modifier has been applied. So you click back down in your stack, make sure you still got your edge faces selected, and these orange lines are the representation of our Edit Poly object before the Turbosmooth modifier has been put on top of it. And what that lets us do is sort of shape this seat cushion in real time without having to go back and forth, undo, and stuff like that. So we're going to select one of these edges, which, if we didn't have all this stuff on, would look like that. And we would want to create a ring selection, which is going to give us a selection of all the edges around the seat cushion. So we're going to go back to the show cage, Turbosmooth, and turn that on. So now we're back to the Edit Poly modifier with our ringed edge selection. And we're going to create a polygon edge loop through there. And we're going to use the slide option here, and we're going to slide that down all the way to the bottom. And note here that you can add this parameter way past 100, but 100 is the number that puts that edge right onto the same plane as the edge loop already. So I tend to like to get it close, but not exactly in the same space. So I usually use like between 90 to 95, depending on the model scale. So now our Turbosmooth modifier has given us some nice soft edges, but has also left the bottom of our seat fairly flat. Okay, so the next step is to add another Edit Poly modifier. Use your Vertex Sub-Object Selection tool. And what we're going to do here is we're going to select all of the vertices on the bottom of the model. And you will see why in a second. So the next step is to add the Cloth Modifier. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come into the cloth and the group, and we're going to get the stack selection, which is going to be those bottom vertices. So that's going to bring those in to the Cloth modifier from our previous Edit Poly modifier. You'll see they're now highlighted. And we want to make those a group. Now with that group, you can do all kinds of things depending on what you're doing with the Cloth modifier, but what we want to do is preserve them. That means that whatever we do within this cloth simulation, that those vertices are not going to move. In other words, the bottom of our seat is going to stay flat. So the next step is we want to click the Object Properties dialog. That's going to bring this window up that gives you all these crazy parameters which you really don't need to look at. So what we want to do is select our object. This is our seat cushion. We want to define it as a cloth object. And in here, you just use a preset. Cotton is the one I like. It's simple, it's straightforward. What these presets do is they adjust all these parameters based off of physical properties that you want to simulate for heavy leather, flannel, whatever. But since this isn't really a cloth simulation per se, we just want this thing to move around. So cotton is straightforward. Now, the only other thing you have to make sure you do here is add a little bit of pressure, which will be, you'll understand why in just a second. So that's added. We've got our seat bottom vertices constrained. Now we're going to look here in our left view. And when you hit simulate local, what that's going to do is it's going to spring the cloth modifier into action. It's going to use that internal pressure inflation value that we added to expand the vertex points of this model. But you'll note that while the top, and the ends, and the sides all seem to inflate, the bottom stays flat, and that's because we added that preservation modifier. So the way this really plays out in the real world is a lot of times this thing gets too inflated or not inflated enough, and you need to tweak your settings. So all you need to do there is click reset state, you're back to where you started. And a lot of times you have to click this and sort of click it again real quick to get it exactly where you wanted. To take a little bit more of an premeditated approach, you can use the simulate, which will actually keyframe this out so you can get the exact keyframe that you want in that simulation rather than just sort of trying to nab it real quick right there. If you're like me in any way, you do these things on the fly a lot of times, so just simple feel for it is good enough. So we now have a seat cushion. It's got the rough shape we want. It's nice and smooth, and it's got a little bit of real world inflation. So to finish this thing off, we're going to put another Edit Poly modifier on here. Put this in the isolation view for a second so you can see what's going on. Now we're going to create our piping. So we want to select this edge that is on the bottom here. You're going to hit the loop command. That's going to select them all. You're going to click the create shape command, and you want to leave it here on linear. And what linear does is it makes sure that each segment between vertices stays straight as it is on the model rather than adding some Bezier curvature on it. So now we want to select that spline that we just created. We're going to enable it in the renderer, and we're also going to enable it in the viewport. And to adjust it, we're going to use the viewport settings. And this just defaulted into the 1/4 of an inch radius, which looks good. But let's say didn't look too good, so you can, having this enable in viewport allows you to visually tweak this to where you want it. So let's put it back to 0.25. Then we're going to go back to our seat cushion object, and we are going to attach that piping we just created. So there we have it. Now, if you are creating these assets for games, real-time rendering, or other low poly applications, you're probably good to go here. You just do your UV mapping and whatever else you got going on. The real advantage, one of the advantages of using subdivision modeling here is that for low poly uses, you can have this, or for high poly uses like photorealistic rendering, stuff like that, you can have this Turbosmooth modifier on top of here. It gives you a nice smooth edge, keeps everything much more realistic. And then you can also drop it into a game or a low poly situation, and just all you got to do is kick that modifier off, and it's back to being not quite as realistic, but much more computation friendly. So since this is going to be used for photorealistic rendering, I'm going to go ahead and leave that on there. And we are good. And that, my friends, is how you create a seat cushion in 3D Studio Max using the Cloth Modifier and Subdivision modeling.